Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen, and we are going to get started on um, chapter 7 here, which deals with the governorship. Um, so we're going to be delving into um, the roles of the Texas governor, and we will be doing some comparison when we look at, and we were kind of doing this a little bit um, when we were looking at the administrative state as well, but now we're going to delve into the governorship here in Texas, and we're going to take a look at what the governor is in terms of what their role is, what are their everyday roles within Texas government, as well as other roles that they take on um, when it comes to things that might come up, such as emergencies, as well as also their role politically, being one of the highest ranking elected officials in the state. So there's a lot of different roles that the governor plays, not just when it comes to state government, but also state politics as well. So we're going to be going ahead and taking a look. Um, so let's take a look at the objectives here. So by the end of this chapter, you should be able to describe the structure of the Texas governorship, including gubernatorial selection, term of office, and tenure possibility, along with the process of impeachment, compensation, and staffing. So we're going to take a look at, you know, we're going to take a look at how the governor is ultimately elected, um, how long their term is, how long, what are the chances of them being able to stay on as governor in terms of their reelection chances, as well as also how much they get paid and what are some of the perks and allotments that they get being the governor of Texas here. Explain how the plural executive model, a basic characteristic of the governorship, limits the governor's power. And so this has been a theme that we have been definitely taking a look at throughout this class in terms of when we do a compare and contrast of the Texas executive when we compare it to like the federal executive, we see that the governor is greatly limited in their power when compared to the president. The president is basically the head of the executive branch at the federal level, and president pretty much has almost complete control within the executive branch and the different departments and the agencies that flow from the president. But in Texas, the governor is limited in terms of when we look at the plural executive and we look at how the other high-ranking Texas state officials that they are not appointed by the governor, but they are elected independently. And so we're also going to take a look at how that impacts the governor's ability to do their job, as well as also the independence of some state commissions, like the Texas, the State Board of Education and the Texas Railroad Commission, and how that also can play a role in how much control does the governor have over public education in Texas when you have a elected board that also oversees that. So we'll take a look at some of these examples. Discuss the personal characteristics that might lead to gubernatorial electoral success. So we will take a look at who tends to fit the profile of who you know when we look at who tends to run for governor and who tends to be elected and how well they perform in their roles. There are certain personal characteristics that do set certain people apart when it comes to their ability to be, to not just be elected, but also to be effective governors here. And so we'll also take a look at um, some comparing and contrasting of some different gubernatorial styles in terms of how they approach the job and how they and what they make of it in terms of being governor. Assess the formal and informal roles the governor plays and their varying leadership styles. So, like I was saying earlier, we will take a look at the formal roles are more so for actually operating within state government in terms of being a chief executive of executive agencies within Texas government. But like I said, there are limits to this, and we will take a look at some of those limits as well as also being an active role in the legislative process. So just like with the president, the lawmaking process is pretty much the same. When if we look at how bills get to the governor's desk, it's pretty much the same process in terms of how bills get to the president's desk. Um, so we will look to see how the governor can also be very proactive in terms of trying to get their agenda passed, which is not any different than what we see in Washington with the presidency. But we will take a look at how The veto power that the governor has, I would say, is even more pronounced than the presidential veto power, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. Okay, and like I said, we will take a look at the leadership styles as well, like I mentioned, and then explain the limitations and strengths of gubernatorial power. So it is kind of a mixed bag when it comes to, excuse me, it is kind of a mixed bag when it comes to gubernatorial power, even though for the most part, a lot of political scientists would say that the governor is rather weakened, especially when you compare to the president, but the governor does have some strengths, such as the ability to call special sessions of the legislature. The absolute veto, like I was talking about a little while ago, is also another strength that the governor has. And what I mean by that is that because the Texas legislature does not meet continuously, um, if the legislature already adjourns and then a stack of bills gets to the governor's desk and the governor vetoes those bills, there's nothing that the legislature can do to override them because the legislature has already left. So that is definitely a very important power that the governor has. Keeping with this strict timeline and this strict when we talked in the previous chapter about the Texas legislature, how they got to get a lot of stuff done in just a couple of months. Governors can use that to their advantage because they know that the legislature is basically running on fumes when it comes to trying to get stuff done at the last minute. It's kind of like at the end of the semester when everyone's just kind of turning everything in. Um, and the governor can take advantage of that and can can ultimately decide the fate of these bills, and there's nothing that the legislature can do about it if they've already adjourned. So this is in a nutshell what we're going to be talking about here, both today and then on Thursday. Okay, so let's take a look at the basic structure of the governor's office. So I'm sorry that we have talked about the plural executive in almost every chapter. This is definitely the recurring theme within Texas government. That's why I've said to y'all before that uh, in some of these times when I've had interviews with other colleges, like to be like to teach adjunct for them, this question always comes up when they're interviewing me about Texas government. This is the one question that always comes up to explain the plural executive. And I totally understand it because this is the basis for a lot of what we cover here within Texas government. So let's go over this again, just as a quick review. So the plural executive is a system of organizing the executive branch that includes the direct election of multiple executives, thereby weakening the chief executive, the governor. So again, a great way to explain this is to compare this setup within Texas to what we have over in Washington, like I was just explaining right now, that the way the federal executive branch works is that when the president is elected and then sworn in, president then has the task of deciding who their and what their administrative setup is going to be throughout the executive branch. So president has tons of, well, not literally tons, but seven, but um, many executive agencies, and of course, the president also has their cabinet members who are the heads of these different departments, and so the people that are going to be leading these departments and these agencies are going to be selected by the president, and of course, they also have to be confirmed by the Senate for the really high-ranking ones. But ultimately, it's the president's first choice, to be that they're not going to be able the nominees aren't going to be able to make it to the Senate to be confirmed if the president doesn't choose them in the first place, right? So the president has that power to decide who's going to be, who ultimately is going to get the chance to serve in a high-ranking position within the executive branch. So that's the way the federal government does it. But Texas is different because in Texas, the governor does not appoint lieutenant governor. The governor does not appoint the commissioner of the general land office, the attorney general, the comptroller. The governor does not appoint those people. Those people are elected independently of the governor. And what this does is this creates a situation where, if we look at like Dan Patrick, the current lieutenant governor, so Governor Greg Abbott cannot technically tell Dan Patrick what to do. Dan Patrick does not technically work under Governor Abbott. Like if you look at the organizational chart, like Greg Abbott is not Dan Patrick's direct supervisor because Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick was elected independently, right? The people are the ones who put him in office. So what this does is this creates a situation where, unlike at the federal level, where President Biden can tell, his different secretaries, what to do because, he hired them basically. um, Greg Abbott has to try to negotiate with Dan Patrick, and they have to try to. Now, of course, it is a lot easier because of the fact they are of the same political party. So that does make things easier because they're going to have similar viewpoints and similar political philosophies, and they're usually going to be on the same page when it comes to what they want to accomplish politically. But that doesn't mean that they're going to agree all the time, and especially they might not agree on the details all the time, right? They might have a certain goal in mind that the state political party shares. They have this vision for what they want for the state of Texas to accomplish politically. That doesn't mean that they're going to be on the same page when it comes to how they accomplish that. So the details is where we see a lot of these differences of opinion. And so the governor has to be able to, and we'll talk about this later on in the chapter, that the governor has to be very good at diplomacy, very good at, getting their message across, but also convincing others to join in on that messaging. And so definitely in Texas, the governor definitely has to be able to, be a good speaker and be able to forge those good working relationships with fellow high-ranking political officials, because you're going to need their help, if you want to get legislation passed, right? So we mentioned before that the lieutenant governor is basically the head of the Texas Senate. So if Governor Abbott wants something to get through the Texas legislature, he's definitely going to have to him and Dan Patrick are definitely going to have to be on the same page, because since Dan Patrick is the head of the Senate, uh, then obviously, of course, they're going to have to try to work together here. So that's in a nutshell what the plural executive is and why it does limit the governor. And of course, that's done on purpose in terms of limiting the governorship. That was a result of what happened after the radical Republicans were kicked out at the end of Reconstruction, where the state constitution was rewritten uh, to to really limit the governor's power, and those limits are still around to this day. In terms of elections, so statewide elections, of course, these are elections for the plural executive members. These are held in even numbered years, and they're also called off years. So even numbered off years. What we mean by off year is off year when compared to the presidential election. So obviously, of course, we've got the presidential election coming up in just a few weeks. Yesterday was actually the first day of early voting. Um, and then we have election day coming up, like I said, just a couple of weeks here. So the statewide elections are never going to be at the same time as the presidential election. It's always going to be 2 years afterwards, or 2 years before, like for this current election. So the last gubernatorial election was in 2022. The next one is going to be in 2026, which will probably be here before you know it. So that's what it means by off year. It's always going to be 2 years removed from the presidential election. Okay, so that's what that means here. And like I was mentioning, lieutenant governor runs independently from the governor, so um, that creates a situation, like I was saying, where um, lieutenant governor is going to have a lot more, um, not just a lot more independence, but a lot more confidence to be able to disagree with the governor, to be able to have their own agenda, to be able to, uh, put forth what they want for the state of Texas to accomplish. Like I said, um, if Dan Patrick disagrees with Governor Abbott, he can definitely be very bold about it because of the fact that he was elected independently. Uh, they're more like coworkers as opposed to, so it's not working for the governor, it's working with the governor, you could say. And so, but like I was saying earlier, that because they're of the same political party, that does make things a lot easier. Like, um, it would be a lot more difficult if, like, let's say there was a Democrat lieutenant governor and a Republican governor, or vice versa. And that's something I definitely want to see. As a political scientist, I definitely want to see that, because I do want to see how that dynamic would work, where um, having members of the opposing party being in the state plural executive, and seeing, how that could, who knows, that might happen in the near future. But it certainly would be interesting to see if that were to happen, because I definitely would like to see how Republicans and Democrats would definitely have to try to work together a lot closer if they're sharing power at the state level. So right now, that's not the case, where because the Republicans do control all the state executive offices. But but we'll see. As Texas becomes a little bit more urbanized, and as we have more people from different parts of the country starting to move to Texas, that could change the political dynamic of the state. Maybe not right now, but could so in the future. But we'll see how that goes. We'll see how that goes if that happens. Terms of office. So 4-year terms. Originally, the under the original 1876 Texas Constitution, the governor was only elected to 2-year terms, but now that was changed to where now governors are 4-year terms, and this is another big difference from the president. And we are going to be doing a lot of comparing and contrasting with the president and the governor. That's why I do have some presidential resources in there, just to kind of not to confuse you all, but to kind of explain that there are some similarities, but there also are some differences between the U.S. president and the Texas governorship. So, and also because there's not as many resources on Texas government as there is, for federal government. A lot more resources there, because Texas government is a more niche class. Since it's only dealing with the government of one specific state. But anyway, let's talk about this. So governors do serve 4-year terms, but that's a similarity to the president. They both serve 4-year terms, but here's a big difference. There are no term limits. So in uh, Texas governors can run as as much as they want, and as long as they keep getting reelected, they can still be eligible to keep serving in the governorship. This is obviously, of course, a departure from the president, where the president is limited to only 2 terms, right? They can only be reelected once, and then they are term committed. Now, do keep in mind that that was not the case beforehand, right? So, under the original Constitution, there were no term limits for the president either. It was basically based on, tradition, and it was based on, just kind of like a gentleman's agreement that, the presidents would not serve more than 2 years. George Washington set that informal precedent when he did not seek a third term, even though a lot of people wanted him to. But then, of course, we had FDR's administration back during the Great Depression and leading into World War II, in which FDR was reelected 4 times. And so um, after that situation, that's when we amended the Constitution to now limit presidents to only 2 4-year terms, because now that had to be put, in writing, basically, because not to say that FDR didn't have his reasons for why he wanted to, because of course, obviously, it was a national security issue being president during World War II. But that's a whole other story. Anyway, but the point I want to make is that for Texas, that governors are not limited in terms of the number of terms that they can serve. That's one of the main reasons why, just in this century, we've only had 2 governors. We've only had Rick Perry and now Greg Abbott, which is a big departure um, from what we used to see in Texas government back during the late 1800s and into the early part of the 20th century. Most governors were not reelected. There was constant turnover with the Texas governorship, so it was rare to see governors get reelected, and certainly not serve more than 2 terms. But now we're seeing where Rick Perry served 3 terms. Greg Abbott was just reelected for a third term. Um, you know, we'll see what happens with him. I'm sure he's going to want to seek reelection, coming up here. We'll see if Governor Abbott has aspirations for the presidency. That is something that has also been discussed, at whether it's been whispered or something like that, which wouldn't be all that surprising, since we had George W. Bush, the former Texas governor, who then went on to become president. So being the governor of the second largest state in terms of size and population does put you, it puts you in the national spotlight. It puts you on a short list of possible candidates, just like over in California, we have Gavin Newsom, the governor over there. He's been discussed as a potential, um, future Democrat candidate. Of course, it also depends on what happens with this current election, right? So if Kamala Harris ends up winning, then she'll probably want to seek reelection as well. So it all depends on a lot of different factors here. And on the Republican side, um, if Trump wins, then that creates a situation where, obviously, of course, he wouldn't be able to run again, because then he would be term committed with the 2 non-consecutive terms. But then it opens up to where, okay, well, who will take his place? Would JD Vance be the next person up, him being his running mate, but maybe not necessarily, right? There. So Greg Abbott could be in that conversation, depending on what happens with this current election. But again, I don't mean to get in too far into that, but it is something to look at maybe for the future. Okay, all right, let's take a look at this table here really quickly because this gives you a little bit of a representation of the variety of powers that the governor has in terms of their strength, and we're going to take a look at this so that way we can come to a little bit of an analysis in terms of when people say, okay, so the governor is in Texas is looked at as rather weak. This is what we mean by this. Okay, so or at least in some cases, because it is kind of a mixed bag because there are some of these rankings where the governor is ranked pretty high, and some of them where they're ranked really low here. So, 4-year terms without restrictions on number of terms or number of consecutive terms. Number of states with the provisions. So there are 12 others. So there are 12 other states that have the same setup where the governor is not term limited. So that is ranked as a high power, right? Because if you can stay on in your political power as often as you would like, considering that you keep getting reelected, then that does make you more powerful because then you can continue being in power if you are still being reelected. The next one is public election of 6 or fewer state executives. So, 29 other states have this provision where it's fewer than six or fewer. Uh, but Texas is ranked fairly low because there are more than six of these state executives that are um, elected independently from the governor. So the governor does not have a lot of power here because the governor can appoint the Secretary of State. But other than that, in terms of the state executive, we have other offices, like I mentioned, Lieutenant Governor, the Comptroller, Commissioner General, Land Office, Agricultural Commissioner, Attorney General. Um, there's all these different executive positions that are elected independently from the governor. So then we look at the government's appointment power. Again, this is also ranked fairly low because I was just mentioning that the governor is not able to appoint, and this is talking about like at the state level in terms of the state executives. The governor does have a lot of appointment power when it comes to like boards and commissions, like I mentioned that the governor cannot appoint members of the state board of education, which oversees public education, which is K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade. But the governor does have the ability to appoint the members of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, which is the college and university version of that. That's the board that oversees colleges and universities. So that is a board that the governor does appoint. Um, but in terms of like appointment power when it comes to state executives, like I said, going back to this one over here. See where's my mouse here? I can't see it. Okay, there's. So going back to over here, because the governor does not have the ability to appoint these people. That's why it's considered rather low here. Shares responsibility for budget preparation. So normally the way budgets are prepared within government, it's usually the top executive that proposes budget. So we see this like at the federal level where um, the budgetary process will involve the president proposing a budget, and then Congress will make changes to that and then decide how much they're going to fund it, whether they're going to fund certain requests or not. So that's normally how it goes here. Now in Texas, the governor the governor can have proposals for the budget, but so can also um, the um, the legislative budget board as well. So there's other people involved in the mix that also ultimately decide what the budget is going to be. And of course, also and of course we also have the legislature themselves ultimately, voting on these provisions or not. So there's a lot more people involved in the budget preparation process in Texas when compared to the federal government. So the president takes the lead on proposing the budget. But in Texas, it's not just the governor who's involved in that in that process of proposing the budget and things like that. Gubernatorial party power, party control. So this is ranked fairly high because, and we'll talk about this more next time, that the governor is looked at as, there's some debate as to who tends to be looked at as the highest ranking political. What I mean by this is, so if we look at like the Republicans and the Democrats in Texas, like if I was to ask people like, okay, who do you all think is the top Republican in Texas? Governor Greg Abbott is definitely at the top of that list. I would personally go with him if you were if people were asking me, because some people might also say, well, maybe it's Ted Cruz because he's the senator from he's the U.S. senator from Texas. But I tend, and that's not to say that he's not very visible, because the fact that Ted Cruz is very vocal when it comes to how he does his job. So that also helps in giving him visibility. Like everyone, even casual people that don't really follow politics know who Ted Cruz is here in Texas, right? Even casual people, because of he's been in the news a lot. But same thing with Greg Abbott. Pretty much everybody knows who Greg Abbott is. Although that would be more so because of his job as the governor. So again, for in Texas, the governor is kind of looked at as like president of the state, even though, as we're seeing here, it's not quite that straightforward. So I would say that, yeah, in my professional opinion, I would say that Governor Abbott, in my opinion, it would be the top ranking Republican in Texas. No disrespect to Ted Cruz, but because Ted Cruz he's in Congress, so it's a little bit more Washington based, and he's also not the head. Now, if he was the Senate Majority Leader, maybe you could make an argument that maybe that would put him at a little bit more, uh, what might put him a little bit closer to Greg Abbott in terms of being the highest ranking Republican in Texas. But still, I would still give the nod to Abbott because Ted Cruz is a member of the Congress, which is a federal legislative body, whereas Greg Abbott is the governor of Texas, right? Who is looked at as, even though technically he's not the absolute head of the Texas executive, he's definitely the most well known, and he definitely gets the most tension and all that, and things like that, and obviously, of course, he can respond to emergencies at the state level. So yeah, so I would say because of the nature of his job being the chief administrator of the executive branch, as opposed to Ted Cruz being a member of the legislative branch, but not really being the head of it. That's why I would say that I would give Greg Abbott the nod when it comes to being the highest ranking Republican in Texas. And then on the Democrat side, it's way more confusing. Like, you know, who is the leader of the Democrats in Texas? That's definitely a lot less straightforward. Some people might say Beto O'Rourke because of his notoriety, but he's not in government right now. So, if Colin Allred were to become, if he were to defeat Ted Cruz in the upcoming senatorial race, that would definitely put him at the top of the list. But yeah, for the Democrats, it's a lot more. It's a lot harder to figure out because the Democrats aren't in power at the state level. So that one's a lot harder to figure out. Item veto over appropriation. So a lot of states have this provision as well, and Texas as does too, and it's ranked fairly high here. So we will talk about the item veto. Basically, what this means is where, unlike the president, who, when legislation is brought to their desk, the president only has, really two choices, or a third choice, they could ignore it, but then it does become law if they just don't do anything. But they can either sign it into law or veto it, right? The governor has a little bit more leeway when it comes to appropriations bills. Those are bills dealing with like funding and budgets and money, where the governor doesn't have to say yes or no, but the governor can also make changes. The governor can strike out portions of the appropriations by saying, no, I'm not going to fund this, I'm not going to fund that. So that is a different quirk that the governor has that the president does. So when factoring all this, they were able to determine that in terms of Bale's ranking of institutional power, that Texas is tied for 40th. So even though you might say, hey, some of these are fairly high and some of these are fairly low, the ranking also doesn't look at these evenly, right? Um, this ranking is looking at like, the ability for like power within the actual job of the governor. Because we're going to talk later on about how gubernatorial party control while it is important, not just when it comes to elections, but it's also important within the legislative process because being the governor and being the governor of the party that is in control of not just the governorship, but also the legislature does give you a lot of power to try to put forth, your agenda. It also doesn't guarantee it. We're going to talk about how that one of Governor Abbott's most recent initiatives was to push for a school voucher program system, and there was pushback against this from Republicans, particularly Republicans in rural parts of the state, like in the Texas Panhandle, that were not in favor of this. Which we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of why they pushed back on that. But yeah, so the point is that when it comes to like the more administrative aspects, the governorship in Texas is ranked fairly low, and then the more informal roles. So that's what it's talking about, right? The formal roles, as we're going to see later on, those tend to be ranked lower than the informal roles. So because formal, you would say, is more closely related to the job description, that's why the Texas governor is ranked at 40th, even though some of these are fairly high. So, okay, let's go ahead and continue here. So let's take a look at the basic structure of the governor's office here. Okay, so tenure. So Texas governors were routinely elected for 1 or 2 year terms until World War II. Like I mentioned, tons of turnover. Um, Not necessarily turnover when it came to different political parties being in control of the governorship, because after the end of the Reconstruction period and the radical Republicans losing power in Texas, and keep in mind, the Republicans back then in the 1800s are they realigned themselves politically, or the ones today realign themselves politically. So Republicans back then would not be Republicans today, and vice versa. Democrats back then would not be Democrats today because they've gone and realigned their political views. But yeah, so what I mean by this is that Republicans were not winning in Texas until after um, until about the 1970s, right? Because again, Republicans back in the 1870s were your more progressives, like Abraham Lincoln and of course, with going and abolishing slavery and all that, right? So you had instability amongst the Democrats. So back then, Texas was a one-party Democrat state. So you had a lot of infighting between the different, between the Democrats, there in Texas. So that was one of the reasons why we had a lot of turnover with the governors here in Texas. But they all were Democrats, just different, but different Democrats pretty much every 2 years, and in the most extreme cases, every 4 years, if a governor was able to be lucky and win re-election in Texas. Only two governors so far in this century, like I mentioned. Rick Perry and Greg Abbott. And so this is definitely a very big departure from what we are accustomed to seeing here in Texas, where now it's a lot easier for governors to win re-election here in Texas here. Let's talk about the impeachment and succession here. So in terms of what I want to talk about in terms of impeachment is that it is easy to remember because, again, the process is pretty much identical to what we see at the national level here. But let's get into what are the qualifications for, or the conditions, I guess you could say, for how the governor could be impeached in Texas. And it's not just the governor, because um, earlier this year we did have the impeachment of current Attorney General Ken Paxton. He was not removed from his position as Attorney General, but he was subjected to the impeachment, and he was impeached. And so it does happen, not very often, but it did happen recently, not with the governorship, but with the Attorney General's office. Okay, but let's take a look at um, the conditions for impeachment. So conditions for impeachment are not specifically listed, but would include official misconduct, incompetence, or failure to perform required duties. And usually there is some overlap on this, like especially when it comes to incompetence, failure to perform. So that would basically be like if the governor's just not doing their job, if they're just not upholding the job requirements and the just not just like I said, just not being able to do their job. not performing those required duties and responsibilities, then yeah, you could definitely um, call for an impeachment and removal of the governor because they're just not doing their job. And the other factor is official misconduct. So that, of course, is what Ken Paxton was impeached on because of criminal complaints and allegations that were made, and it's really fascinating in terms of what happened. So I definitely recommend for you all to read up on that. We'll definitely talk about that later on when we get to the attorney general here. We'll talk about that probably in the judicial chapter, but it is very interesting, and I will um, upload more of those resources where you all can see for yourselves in terms of what the issues were to cause for Ken Paxton to be impeached. But again, focusing on the governor, but I do want to mention that because, of course, it happened recently. Follow similar process to the national level, like I said. Yeah, the impeachment process in Texas is pretty much identical, where you have you'll have like a select committee that will go and investigate. Um, we'll invest, we'll conduct an investigation into these executive officers, and then if there's enough evidence, then the select committee will they will approve for articles of impeachment to be constructed, and then it's going to go before the Texas House to be voted upon, and that just needs a civil majority, right? So if you get a civil majority to vote in favor of the articles of impeachment, then the state executive official is officially impeached. But remember that impeachment is a two-step process. It's not, it's impeachment, and then it has to go to the Senate for removal. So then you have the trial held in the Senate, where senators basically act as jurors, and then you have the House impeachment managers, who are basically the prosecution because they're bringing the case against the executive official, and of course you have the defense. Usually it is their defense attorneys and all that, and they're trying to defend their client from being removed from office, and it needs a two-thirds vote. So this is why it's very hard to to impeach and remove a governor. The only time it's happened in Texas was Paul Ferguson back in the early 1900s, and he was ultimately replaced by his wife, Ma Ferguson, who ended up being the first female governor of Texas. But yeah, it's only happened once in the state where they actually were removed. And like I mentioned earlier, Ken Paxton was not he was not really in any threat of being removed because the vote was pretty much along party lines, where all the Republicans voted against impeachment, all the Democrats in the Senate voted for, and the Republicans have, I think it's like a 19-12. It's that type of majority in the Texas Senate, something like that. So again, you would have needed like several Republicans to vote with the Democrats to ultimately remove Ken Paxton, but that did not happen here. And Dave Phelan, the speaker at the time, was pretty. He was the one that put forth um, the impeachment of Ken Paxton, and then later on he removed him from the House. It's gotten really bad. It's pretty interesting to see like the bad blood between Dave Phelan and Ken Paxton here. Just kind of so there's been a lot of this infighting amongst the Republican circles here in Texas. Very, very interesting. Okay. Anyway, so continuing with the basic structure of the governor's office. So the Texas governor's current salary is 153,750. So you might think that that's a pretty good amount of money. And that's not to say that it isn't. However, if you think about this, yes, that pay is pretty good, but it's going to come with a lot of responsibility, insane responsibility. Basically, being, even though technically, as I've said, they're not technically the head of the Texas executive, but public certainly believes that they are. I mean, most people in Texas don't even know about the plural executive and how it works. So they just assume that the governor, is in charge of the executive branch, and that's not to say the governor doesn't have a lot of power in the executive branch. But anyway, so again, I've made that point several times, but the point is that with all the job responsibility, having to respond to emergencies, having to be intricately involved in the budgetary process, having to um, be, like I said, be basically the top ranking party official and all the work that goes with that, you can see how this amount of money is probably not really commensurate with all the work the governor has to do. In fact, the governor isn't even the highest paid um, state employee within the state of Texas. Usually it tends to be what's his name? Who's the Texas Longhorns head coach? Sarkisian, right? I think that's his name. So he definitely makes a lot more money than Governor Abbott. Now, granted, most of that money is not from taxpayer money. A lot of that comes from television contracts, because these and of course I'm still disappointed in the Longhorns losing to the Bulldogs, but I'm not really surprised by that, unfortunately. I didn't expect for Texas to win. But it is what it is. But yeah, with that being said, a lot of that money does come from like TV contracts, so it's not most of it isn't taxpayer money. But they still are technically state employees, right? So usually those tend to be the highest ranking state employees in Texas are like the head coaches of like the Longhorns, Texas A&M, like I know Jumbo Fisher, he was isn't there anymore, but in the news, like when he left, he got like this multi-million dollar um like severance package or something like that. But again, most of that is not taxpayer money. Most of that does come from these the money generated from television contracts that these college football games generate. And then in other states like in North Carolina, Coach K, longtime coach for Duke, he was also the highest paid state employee over in North Carolina. So in some states where college basketball is more popular, then the college basketball coaches will get paid more. So, but anyway, but then of course the governor does also get a lot of fringe benefits, including obviously, of course, staying in the governor's mansion there in Austin, as well as, you know, um, transportation and also security detail. And of course, obviously, we'll talk about how when we look at staff and organization, that the governor also has an extensive staff that works under the official office of the governor of Texas, right? So in terms of the roles of the staffers and the people that work under the governor and what they do, so these are like your everyday office workers, but they're not your yes, they obviously they do clerical work and they obviously do a lot of the office jobs and things like that, but they also have a lot of administrative responsibilities, such as to voice the governor's priorities with the legislature and to the public. So a lot of these members of the governor's staff will have meetings um, with members of the Texas legislature, especially when it comes to like meeting with the legislative leadership, whether it's meeting like with the speaker or Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, as well as also meeting with individual members of the Texas legislature, especially if like let's say there's a close vote on a provision that Governor Abbott is wanting for the legislature to pass, and let's say there's a few members of the state legislature that are on the fence on this, then the staffers will go and meet with those legislators, and they'll try to see if they can convince them to support this bill that Governor Abbott is wanting for the legislature to pursue. Um, so they're basically they basically are the representatives of the governor and will go and meet with those members. And sometimes, of course, the governor will also do that themselves. Um, but it does help to have other people to assist with that, right? So the governor's not having to meet with all of these state legislators individually. Recommend appointment candidates. So again, this would be like for boards and commissions that the governor is able to fill, like I mentioned, like the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, the staffers would be the ones to kind of vet different candidates for that role, and ultimately provide Governor Abbott with research and background information so that the governor can make an informed decision on who he wants to ultimately appoint for those boards that he can make appointments to. Prepare the executive budget request. So the staffers also are in constant communication with state agencies in terms of what the state agencies are requesting in terms of their budget request. So if let's say like, Texas Department of Criminal Justice, let's say they are requesting additional funds because let's say they need to build more prisons because the incarceration rate is increasing. They would have to make those requests, to the governor so that the governor can then make those proposals to the state legislature to see if they can provide the funding for that, right? So the staffers are kind of like the link between the state agencies and the governor when it comes to budget requests. coordinate the various departments and activities of the governor's office. So um, this would be, and this is also kind of goes with the scheduling the appointments and activities, right? So this would be, um, just ensuring that, setting up meetings for the governor, ensuring that, because the governor, of course, is going to be very busy, not just when it comes to meetings with state executives, but also meetings with leaders within the private sector as well. The governor also will go and meet, like, with heads of these major companies and corporations. Like now that Elon Musk is moving his operation over here to Texas, that him and Governor Abbott will definitely have a lot of meetings in terms of what the future will hold for Tesla, in terms of as well as SpaceX and how that can benefit Texans when it comes to jobs and all that. So the governor will also have meetings with prominent private sector business owners and the like here, as well as also just scheduling the daily activities and the daily schedule for the governor here. Okay, let's see. Okay, so okay, so yeah, we last thing that we'll cover here for today, and then we'll finish here, and then we'll go through the formal roles next time here. So the formal qualifications again, in order to run for governor, you must be at least 30 years old, be a citizen of the United States, and have been a resident of Texas for at least 5 years. So that's not really all that much in terms of qualifications. Many people in the state would definitely qualify. I know I certainly would qualify to run for governor. I meet those requirements here. That doesn't mean that you have everybody running for this position, because there are certain personal characteristics that are needed. And these are very similar, if not almost identical, to the same type of personal characteristics that we saw to serve in the Texas legislature. So remember that when we discussed that in chapter 6, that the people who tend to serve in the Texas legislature tend to kind of be, for lack of a better term, rich old white guys, or maybe like rich middle-aged white guys type of thing. Not to be facetious, but that's kind of like how we can sum it up in general. But in going more detail, um, governors have overwhelmingly been white Anglo-Saxon Protestant WASP males who are politically conservative and involved in civic affairs and wealthy, right? So they, like I said, I think that that description kind of narrows it down a bit, right? So they do tend to be wealthier. They tend to be more prominent within their community. So they tend to be like members of, like, let's say, like the city chamber of commerce or some of these other groups. These prestigious groups, like they might be part of like the Sierra Club or something like that, or some of these other clubs that assist with city with community projects and things like that. So they definitely get their name out there, right? And of course, obviously, they do tend to be conservative because, as we can see, Republicans are, they dominate state politics. So you're definitely gonna need to be conservative if you want to, have a chance of being governor, at least at this time. And also having previously held elected office also is a big plus. And we've seen this with the last two governors, right? So um Rick Perry, he was the lieutenant governor at the time when then current governor George W. Bush was elected president. So basically he resigned, for a promotion, so then the next person up in line. So if anything happens to the governor, the line of succession is the lieutenant governor then takes over. So Rick Perry then became governor after George W. Bush left. Then of course he won re-election several times. And then current Governor Greg Abbott was the former attorney general. So Ken Paxton's current position used to be held by it used to be held by Greg Abbott. That's when I first learned about him. When I saw that, when I learned that he when I was studying state politics early on, and I got to know him a little bit in terms of being the attorney general at the time. So you do usually see that, where you do usually see where governors will have held previous elected office. And usually, if they can be members of the state plural executive, that's going to be a good that'll be a good building a stepping stone for them to move on to try to go for governor here. So most typical candidate, Ann Richards. So she was actually the last female governor that we had, and actually the last Democrat governor. So she really didn't hold elective office. She was mostly as like some consulting work and doing some lobbying work. So she really, So she kind of was involved in politics, but not, but kind of like on the outside, not actually holding office and not being an actual member within government, but kind of working, on the outside. And, so she did have a lot of government experience, but more so, kind of more so like with lobbying and consulting a lot of stuff. So that's why the book says that she tends to be rather atypical here. So, okay, so let me go ahead and let's see, because I think it's already going to be time here. Pretty much. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let me go ahead and stop here. Let me stop the share and let me stop the video here.